So, I'm going to talk about a Thomistic perspective on attention deficit disorder, and I'm basically going to take this opportunity to introduce Thomistic psychology or an outline of it as a corrective, as a more comprehensive approach to psychology than that of modern science. Um, the modern diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, or ADD, ADHD, it encapsulates a perennial human challenge: sustaining focus amidst distraction. This diagnosis, or its overdiagnosis and the overmedication that is a consequence of that, it's a controversial subject. And rather than get into that, I'm just going to present again an elementary introduction to the psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas, which actually has a lot of overlap with Aristotle, so it's ancient or traditional. I'm going to try to show how traditional religion and its anthropology actually provide a more robust framework for mental health. Um, and I'm going to quote Wilder Penfield here, who was an American neurosurgeon. He specialized in epilepsy. He wrote a book called The Mystery of Mind, and he said that throughout my own scientific career, I, like other scientists, have struggled to prove that the brain accounts for the mind. But perhaps the time has come when we may profitably consider the evidence as it stands and ask the question, can the mind be explained by what is known about the brain? And from the point of view of Thomistic psychology, which again predates Wilder Penfield by 600 years, or if we go back to Aristotle, predates him by 1,000 years. Um, it's it's interesting because they answer that question. The answer to that question is no. You cannot explain mind by just looking at the brain. All of its functions cannot be localized in a physiological organ. So no, the answer's there, and the correct frame that would probably have addressed all of Wilder Penfield's, all of those mysteries had been answered thousands of years ago. So that's kind of why I always want to talk about this. And this is just an opportunity. So ADHD is sort of it's getting picked on just because it's a case study, but not that the airs there are any more glaring than on any other subject of mental health. So Thomism reframes ADHD by interpreting it as a disorder in the soul's faculties. So in particular, it's going to be said that the imagination in ADHD ceases to serve the will and instead dominates it, resulting in a disruption of the mind's natural hierarchy of powers. This perspective illuminates the roots of inattention um, and its exacerbation by modern habits, modern technology, and it shows a path to recovery through things like other discredited methods like virtue, discipline, and spiritual practice, providing a holistic framework for mental flourishing. This video might not please a lot of people because it flies in the face of the self-understanding of a lot of people who suffer from this condition. And try to be sensitive to that, but it's a sophisticated point of view. It's not to be easily dismissed. Um, so we'll go into the hierarchy of powers. Um, so to grasp the concept of attention itself and attention deficit in particular through a Thomistic lens, we first have to understand Aquinas' model of the soul. He defined it as the form of the body. So the body, it was the animating force of the body, and the body was animated by a structured hierarchy of faculties or powers. So he divides, and Aristotle also divided in a similar way, these faculties or powers of the soul into three groups. Um, so there was the vegetative powers. These were governing basic life functions like growth, nutrition, reproduction. They were shared with both plants and animals. They're less important for our understanding of mental health, but they would be essential for studying other physiological ailments. Then there's the sensitive powers, which will be important for us. They're shared with animals, and they encompass the five external senses that we're all familiar with: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. as well as 4 internal senses that we're maybe a little bit familiar with, but not in St. Thomas Aquinas' meaning. And we'll talk about those specifically, the 4 internal senses, which are situated in the brain. So the external senses, they're familiar, they need less explanation, but we're going to comment on the internal senses. And then thirdly, though, there's the intellectual powers, which are unique to humans. And those are hierarchically the highest powers, and that's the intellect. And the intellect abstracts universal truths from the lower powers, particularly the imagination, and we'll get into that more. And the will. So you have the intellectual powers that sit above all the others, which are the intellect and the will. The will, of course, directs choices towards presumably rational ends. So let's look a little bit at the sensitive powers in a little bit more detail. So the first is the common sense. So common sense combines the data from the 5 external senses. So if you have sense data about a certain object that is actually out there in reality, such as an apple, you've got the apple's color, texture, scent, taste. The common sense takes that data from the 5 external senses, combines it, and produces the unified perception of this particular apple that I am sensing right now. So then there's the imagination or fantasia. And this is one that we are familiar with, but what we probably don't understand is how fundamental it is for our understanding of anything. We think it just comes into play when we're trying to, imagine some creative idea, something maybe that's not real, but it's the hub of experience between our understanding and our senses. It actually the imagination maintains the presence of the sensory images, or called phantasms, in the mind. So it maintains images in the mind of what we are thinking about. It presents them to the knower for the abstraction of ideas. The memory is also capable of recalling phantasms, the imagination is also capable of recalling phantasms of past experience. It does that by way of memory. And then it can recombine them by way of the cogitative power, which we will mention next. So it serves as a kind of a critical bridge or hub of the internal senses. So there was the cogitative power, which was mentioned. In humans, it's different in animals, but in humans, this faculty is guided by reason. It is not the same thing as reason, but it discerns and associates between the images that the imagination is presenting. So it does that based on experience, distinguishing it from the animal, which in the animals it's called the estimative power, and operates by instinct in animals. And then, of course, there's the memory, which we've mentioned is distinct from the imagination. The imagination, if it wants to deal with past images, it recalls things from the memory. So the memory stores the images or phantasms and their associated cogitative judgments for later recall. So the memory functions basically like you would expect according to the common usage. So you can see probably, or start to see, that attention in this model is not a distinct faculty. It's not something you have or don't have, or just something that can break in and of itself. It's the coordinated action of the intellect and will directing these sensitive powers, in particular the imagination. The intellect relies on the imagination to supply clear, relevant phantasms according to its direction, so that it can abstract meaning from those images, understand them, reason about them. So the will is the one that does that on behalf of the intellect, or in coordination with the intellect, it commands the imagination to focus or suppress irrelevant images. So a well-ordered mind would hinge on a disciplined imagination that is obedient to the will's rational guidance, serving the intellect. So attention deficit in Thomistic terms arises when the imagination resists the governance of the intellect and will. Instead of presenting stable, task-relevant phantasms, the imagination generates a chaotic torrent of fleeting images, sounds, and associations, pulling the intellect into a state of mental wandering or distraction. This unruly imagination hinders the intellect's ability to fix upon a single phantasm, no matter how much it wants to. Then it can't abstract concepts from those images, nor can it engage in sustained reasoning about things. It renders complex thought exhausting and, experientially impossible. So the will, tasked with directing the imagination, faces significant resistance when it's in this state of disobedience or disarray. While the will itself may not be deficient, it could even be a very strong will, its efforts get thwarted by a hyperactive, chaotic, or poorly, what we would say in Thomistic terms, which we'll explain later, is poorly habituated imagination. This internal disorder aligns with the modern observations of executive dysfunction in ADHD, which is very similar to behaviors like impulsivity, impulsivity is also linked to outcomes such as obesity. And in fact, that connection of ADHD with impulsivity and lack of control over the imagination, that link with obesity is a relevant correlation because modern research actually notes a strong correlation between ADHD and increased risk for obesity. It attributes it to poor meal planning or impulsive food choices, but probably Aquinas would interpret this as a broader failure of the will to properly habituate the soul's lower faculties, whether that's the imagination in the case of ADHD, or the appetites, which we're not really going to talk about here. But these are both examples of a broader failure of the will to habituate the lower faculties in general to reason's guidance. Thus, inattention and impulsivity are not disparate symptoms, but manifestations of a single root, a disrupted hierarchy where the will struggles to assert its rightful authority over the soul's lower powers. So modern media, I want to be careful with this because you don't want to sound like one of those old cranks that's violent video games cause violence, stuff like that. But it's modern media makes things worse. It takes a potential for disorder and just dumps gasoline all over it. So the modern media environment, or the modern environment in general, really, significantly exacerbates this disorder by habituating the imagination to passivity and fragmentation. Aquinas taught that repeated actions form habits, stable dispositions that shape behavior with ease and permanence. And that's very similar to habit as we would understand it. So constant exposure, but a lot of these are formed without us even knowing, much like other habits. So constant exposure to rapid prepackaged media, short form videos, fast-paced television, video games, social media feeds, that trains the imagination to expect a relentless stream of external stimuli. Television in general, it's one vivid, bright image after another. You can actually see the escalation of this in children's movies, going back to, say, Bambi, which has long, orchestral, slow-moving segments that last several minutes, and then jumping to, I don't know, any of the children's feature films today, which are rapid fire. One thing, it's very, very jumpy. And just consider that throughout this discussion and what that might do to the imagination that is sitting there taking all that in passively, how that might habituate the imagination to a certain speed of images. So in this context, the will, which is supposedly directing the imagination as to which images it's supposed to hold up in front of the intellect for abstraction, it's rarely engaged. The will isn't engaged hardly at all to direct the imagination. And so the imagination becomes accustomed to following external cues instead of rational intent. The will, which is supposed to be the driver, ends up taking a back seat, and then something like the television becomes the driver. And it's very, very hard to reverse that habit. So, for example, a child immersed in a digital environment where images and sounds shift every few seconds, that child's going to develop in the imagination a habit of passive reception. That's undeniable. That's without any voluntary intent. The imagination, no longer required to generate its own phantasms or sustain phantasms for any more than a fraction of a second, becomes this bucket catching a torrent, as Aquinas might describe it. When the child attempts tasks requiring active, prolonged focus, such as listening to a lecture in school, or just engaging in conversation for any amount of time, their imagination rebels. It craves the novelty. It craves it, and it resists sustained effort of focus. Even if the child is highly motivated to try and focus, because the problem is not in motivation. The problem is in a lower faculty that is prior to the will. So this inversion of the soul's hierarchy, where the imagination dictates to the will, it renders concentration nearly impossible. The modern use of screens as a babysitter left on for hours at a time, it further entrenches this passivity, undermining the will's capacity to govern the imagination almost entirely. Modern medicine often mischaracterizes ADHD, framing it as a neurodevelopmental condition rooted in brain structure or neurotransmitter dysregulation, such as dopamine imbalances. So, common patient self-understandings, often encouraged by clinicians, further obscure the issue. So, there's a diagnostic issue that leads to almost sufferers of this condition being trained to misunderstand their condition. And the sad part of that is that it almost reinforces the disorder by presenting it as an innate trait. And then in order to help people psychologically cope with their suffering, which is legitimate suffering, but they'll give them sort of a set of ideas that almost present it as a superpower or an advantage, to say, oh, well, look at it this way. It's actually, it's a compliment to have ADHD. One of those, I guess, would be the faster brain myth that I've heard from a handful of people. Almost everyone that I've ever heard talk about their ADHD has talked about this faster brain thing. So it's basically a way of rationalizing their distraction by saying that their mind works much faster than everybody else's. And so when they drift off, 3 seconds into a conversation, it isn't because they're unable to control their attention. It's because they already know what you're about to say. They just moved faster. They already know what you're about to say. So in other words, they have a superpower where they can anticipate, from partial information, they can extrapolate and know exactly what you were going to say. Aquinas would clarify that this reflects not intellectual speed, but on the contrary, it's not intellectual at all. It's actually an overactive imagination, which is what we were talking about. It's a product. That conclusion that you thought I was headed for when I was talking to you, that's an imagined conclusion. It's a product of your imagination. because it's not from external data. I didn't actually tell you that. So the intellect requires complete data, full sentences, in order to abstract meaning. So this process demands patience, and in ADHD, the imagination rapidly generates associations upon hearing partial information. It races ahead. This isn't an acceleration of the process of judgment. It is actually bypassing rational judgment almost entirely. For instance, upon hearing the first words of a sentence, the ADHD imagination might flood the mind with related images or memories, and let's say in unmedicated children, this would prompt interruptions or, that hyperactive fidgeting, something like that. In an adult, particularly in an adult on amphetamines, which sort of force the torrent into a linear channel without slowing it down or controlling it, in adults, it leads to the whole jumping to conclusions that I can move on distraction. These latter are the ones who think that they have the superhuman power of anticipation. But this tendency is not a sign of superior understanding. It's a sign of impatience combined with pharmaceutical stimulants. It's a result of the imagination usurping the intellect's role and providing imaginary conclusions to the conversation, instead of merely presenting the data like the imagination was supposed to, for the intellect to then abstract valid conclusions based on reality. And here's the real problem with this, is labeling that chaotic process as a talent, as a superpower. It validates the disorder, discouraging the cultivation of attentiveness. It is less a badge of superior neural velocity, and it's more a confession that control of the imagination has been surrendered to the dictates of sense data. Another, I don't know if it's a misconception, it's just a trait that is worth talking about, is the need for distractions or their background noise. So that's another common thing for ADHD people to talk about, is how background noise such as television aids their focus. And so that warrants understanding. It's not wrong, but Aquinas would explain that this reveals the imagination's addiction to external stimuli, its reliance on it. And this reliance of external stimulus betrays a powerful habit formed through passive consumption of media. The imagination, which is habituated to rapid-fire phantasms, such as those delivered in torrents by the television, enters a state of quiet agitation, I guess you'd call it, when it is forced to endure silence. Such an imagination is so habituated to constant external stimulus that, much like an addict, it begins to feel withdrawals when deprived of its need. Except that for addicts, the withdrawals take hours or days, but in ADHD, the absence of stimulus becomes unbearable within seconds. This situation makes concentration in a peaceful environment, which would be desirable for a lot of people, it makes it seem impossible. So background television supplies just enough phantasms to keep the restless appetite half occupied, so that the will, which is still weakened in its control, can seize a small share of attention for the task at hand. The noise, in this sense, functions like a narcotic. It dulls the pain of the unfocused soul. The will, rather than commanding the imagination, bargains with it. It says, if I let you graze on these flickering images, will you grant me a few minutes of real thought? This is servitude of the superior faculty to an inferior one. The Thomist would insist that this need for background noise is further evidence of the disorder. It's certainly not a remedy for it. And someone might respond, so what? It helps people cope. What's the big deal? But it's a big deal if it obscures the true nature of the struggle that people are presumably needing help with. So the last one is a problem. It's a big problem. It's the prescription of stimulants and the subjective calm that they provide. These are amphetamines. So stimulants like amphetamines are said to calm individuals with ADHD, despite what, in my experience and probably a lot of others, is the readily observable frenetic energy that these people often display. I mean, I even heard someone say it's like crackhead energy, and I would say that's accurate. Um, all while we're being told that this calms me down. Um, Aquinas distinguishes true calm, tranquilitas ordinis, the harmony of faculties under reason's guidance, distinguishes that from the subjective relief that would be provided by stimulants. The relief in experience, but not in body and in reality. Um, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, but these drugs suppress the imagination's chaos by channeling it into a focused, very brittle, focused state, like a bunch of wild horses being forced into a canyon. It doesn't slow them down, and it serves its purpose, though, in a sense of treating symptoms but not the cause, which is what a lot of modern medicine does. It manages symptoms, but it doesn't treat. So it allows a kind of focus, but the will remains a passenger. It's driven by pharmacological force rather than rational command. So, for instance, a person on stimulants may hyper focus on a task, but that's what you'll notice is that it is not normal peaceful focus, it's hyper focus. They might still talk about how calm they are compared to what they normally feel like, but they'll still exhibit an almost frantic behavior, as they pantingly move from activity to activity, often driving themselves to exhaustion, unable to find the real calm that comes from controlled passions. Um, the claim that it calms me down, I guess, just reflects a neurological effect, not the achievement of true tranquility. And in spite of this calm, we all know, how ADHD sufferers can often act in reality. So all of these narratives, I mean, it's not to pick on people who suffer from this or to downplay the difficulty, and they're all well intentioned, but they risk entrenching the disorder by framing ADHD as a fixed identity or, like we said, as an advantage. By presenting it as a badge of honor in some cases, the clinicians who say this or others who encourage this, they discourage the arduous work of reordering the soul's faculties. And they do the individual a disservice by reinforcing the imagination's sovereignty over the intellect. That's not to say the alternatives are easy, but that's life. That's what it's like being a fallen human being. We all have issues. Some of us are predisposed in the Thomistic sense of bodily or neurological predisposition. We're predisposed to struggle with certain things, and there's no denying that just as some are more prone to substance abuse, addiction, others are more prone to be easily habituated to attention deficit disorder. The solution in every case, all of them, is a difficult one. And in many cases, the bad habit, once acquired, can even be destroyed. So it might truly be something that is with you, that looks innate. But you still have to fight against it, try to manage it. But that doesn't justify patients or doctors preferring, myths or self-delusions. So restoring order, a Thomistic path to recovery. So if attention deficit stems from poor habituation, the remedy lies in cultivating virtuous habits to restore the soul's proper order. That's what virtue does. Virtue, in the Thomistic sense, is not just a set of rules that you arbitrarily have to follow because the Bible says so. Virtue is the operating in accordance with reason. That's what it is. It's acting reasonably, and it's acting in a way that you were designed to act. So Aquinas offers a multifaceted approach. Cultivate the virtues. If most examples of poor mental health can be framed in terms of bad habituation, which in moral terms is vice, that's what a good and bad habit is. It's virtue and vice, in cases where it's voluntary. Then the solution here is to pursue good habituation, pursue virtue. Examples in this case would be the common virtue of temperance, which moderates the passions. Also fortitude, which sustains effort through difficulty. And then there's even studiousness, which pursues knowledge methodically, in detail, and it strengthens the will's authority over the imagination. These Thomistic Aristotelian virtues empower individuals to govern their faculties, and it counters the passions that, to quote St. Thomas, bind or impede the acts of reason. So, for example, practicing temperance can restrain the imagination's craving for novelty, while studiousness trains the mind to dwell on a single subject. Then there's discipline and strengthening of the will. Structured routines like reading complicated texts, memorizing poetry, or engaging in deliberate mental tasks, they retrain the imagination to serve the intellect. Limiting passive media consumption is critical to breaking the habits of fragmentation. For children, parental guidance is essential to enforce these disciplines, countering the pacifying effects of excessive screen time. Reading is a powerful tool in this context. And it should be understood that we mean actual reading, not listening to someone else read by way of audiobook. Audiobooks might have their place, but they enable passive reception of information. Whereas actual reading, demands the exercise of more control over the attention, directing in a more granular way the imagination in generating and sustaining those images or phantasms, which obviously fosters focus. In light of the contemporary epidemic of ADHD, it's a crime that libraries' summer reading programs now equate audiobook listening with reading and reward it the same. This discards one of the primary benefits of reading, usually by pretending that it never existed, and it encourages parents to make things worse for their kids by exchanging one of the most powerful focus-building tools, reading, and instead further habituating their children to passive reception of electronic auditory data, which is ultimately only slightly removed from television. So lastly, there's prayer and mortification, the most unpleasant ones on the list for modern science to acknowledge. But mental prayer requires sustained focus on divine truths, the most lofty, subtle things to contemplate. It disciplines the imagination to align with reason in many ways. For example, meditative practices, if you're Catholic, which you probably are if you care about St. Thomas Aquinas. There's the rosary, which demands that the mind hold a single phantasm steady, training the will's command. There's mortification, practices of self-denial, fasting, limiting sensory pleasures, which strengthens the will's control, purifies the phantasms presented to the intellect. These traditional practices offer powerful tools for reordering the soul's faculties. So, okay, we're getting there. We don't have too much left here, but we're going to talk about the bridging Thomism and modern science. Modern science insists on empirical observation and materialism in every respect, so it's quite a difficult thing to bridge here. The problem is that for Christianity and for St. Thomas Aquinas in particular, the mind is only partially localized in the brain, like we talked about at the very beginning with the neurosurgeon, the specialist in epilepsy. The memory and the imagination, the internal senses, for example, are situated in the brain. They're localized. That's why damage to certain areas of the brain, the frontal lobe, and so things like that can have effects. But the intellect, which understands, is not localized in the brain. Read Wilder Penfield's Mystery of Mind if you want a modern scientist's approach to this, and the reasons why he believed that, which are very well demonstrated. But if the imagination is an internal projection screen that displays sense data to the intellect, to the knower, then the intellect is like the watcher who draws meaning from the projected image. The projector is a material thing. The watcher is not. Modern science denies all of this, as religious pseudoscience and traditional spiritual theology or anthropology is rejected in favor of the so-called evidence-based medicine, which is another way of saying materialistic, atheistic medicine. Clinicians then predictably view ADHD as a heritable neurobiological disorder, measurable through brain imaging and treatable primarily with pharmacotherapy, or maybe, but not usually in my experience, with behavioral therapy. Further, they argue that framing inattention as a failure of will risks what they call stigmatizing patients. And they say also ignores certain physiological factors and promotes untested remedies like discipline or prayer over proven interventions like drugs. So the Thomistic response hinges on its robust concept of habit or habitus, which we've already talked about quite a bit. But to explain it a little bit more, unlike the modern notion of habits as just a developed reflex, Aquinas' habitus denotes a stable disposition. It's almost like something that has become second nature, but it's a second nature that was forged through repeated voluntary actions. A habit of inattention formed in a media-saturated environment can become so entrenched that it mimics an innate disorder. So a child repeatedly exposed to rapid stimuli may develop a deeply ingrained disposition to distraction, appearing as a neurological condition to modern diagnostic tools. We can even affect brain image scans if we entrench these habits far enough. Implicit learning from parents' behaviors can further simulate heritability, and confuse the matter because some disordered habits are absorbed unconsciously. So just consider an analogy. A person walking a path daily wears a deep trench in the ground, which a modern observer might mistake for a natural feature of that terrain. Similarly, ingrained habits of inattention, though now seemingly unchangeable, originate in repeated choices, at least to a degree. Aquinas acknowledges physiological predispositions, and here we could talk about his fomes peccati, or what he calls tinder of sin, which is the inclination to disorder and rooted in human nature. It varies from person to person. In other words, we're all fallen, but we might exhibit that fallenness through our bodies and through our neurology in various ways, making us more predisposed to this or that type of fallenness. But he would emphasize that chronic inattention in most cases will not be purely physiological, but will stem from voluntary actions over time, usually beginning in childhood. And as with most formative experiences that happen in childhood, the fact that they are acquired early explains why they are so hard to perceive and eradicate later. This perspective does not deny the lived reality of ADHD, but it offers a causal explanation rooted in moral and voluntary agency, complementing physiological insights. It uses the terminology of habit, but in this respect, there is no implied sin, if by that we mean guilt on the part of the individual for their condition. Usually, the habit of inattention is developed long before children are at the age of moral responsibility anyway. On the other hand, modern medicine's materialistic bias, which assumes all mental disorders have physiological causes, overlooks the role of habituation, mistaking the trench of habit for an innate feature of the soul's landscape. So, perhaps the most damaging aspect of modern approaches is their tendency to reframe ADHD as an unchangeable identity. Or at least that's the self-understanding that people often walk away with once they're diagnosed. So by teaching individuals that they're helpless against their condition, or by presenting it as a superpower in some cases, clinicians risk entrenching the disorder. Some individuals embrace ADHD as a badge of honor, or just something that they have to, learn to just deal with. Then they inevitably taking it as that kind of a disability, basically. I am neurodivergent, and that's just the way I am. It is inevitably used to excuse problems, unprofessional behavior, impulsive behavior. Aquinas would argue that this reflects a misunderstanding of the soul's potential for transformation. Ignoring the role of habituation risks perpetuating mental illness in general, whereas recognizing the power of deliberate choices offers hope for change. For example, an individual who frequently cites ADHD to justify tardiness or inattention may be reinforcing their disordered habits rather than striving for improvement. It's a cycle exacerbated by the absence of a robust psychology of habit. And again, none of that is to say that these aren't real problems deeply entrenched that may never be beaten completely. But Anything that completely eliminates the possibility of improvement when improvement is possible is a problem. The Thomistic perspective likens the mind to a ship with the intellect and will as captain and the imagination and cogitative power as the crew. In attention deficit disorder, the crew, habituated to chase every external stimulus, rebels against the captain's orders, causing the ship to be impossible to direct. Modern medicine may diagnose a faulty vessel, calling it an innate neurological flaw, but Aquinas insists on examination of the crew's training. And he discovers a mutiny of the imagination by way of acquired habit rooted in past choices. Through the cultivation of virtue, disciplined routines, and spiritual practices like prayer and mortification, individuals can, perhaps not completely, and certainly not easily, retrain the imagination to some degree to serve the intellect, restoring the soul's hierarchy. This arduous but empowering path transforms disorder into ordered freedom, steering the mind toward its true destination, which should always be truth, knowledge, and the peace of mental flourishing.